In 2009, a young wife sat calmly in a car and ordered her husband's murder. What she didn't know, every word was being recorded. This is the real story of Dalia Dippolito, a case of deception, betrayal, and a police sting that stopped a killing before it could happen. In the summer of 2009, a carefully planned crime began to unfold in the coastal city of Boynton Beach, Florida. It wasn't the kind of place you'd expect to find the center of a murder-for-hire plot, but it would soon become the backdrop for a case that captured national attention. At the heart of the story was a young woman named Dalia Dippolito, in her mid-20s, who appeared to be living an enviable life with her husband, Michael Dippolito, a man in his late 30s. On the surface, they were a newlywed couple starting fresh. Beneath that, a much darker truth was slowly taking shape. Michael Dippolito wasn't a stranger to law enforcement. Years before meeting Dalia, he had been convicted of fraud and had spent time in prison. After serving his sentence, Michael was trying to turn his life around. He got into real estate and made decent money, managing to rebuild his lifestyle. When he met Dalia, she seemed like a fresh start. She was attractive, confident, and affectionate. Their romance was fast and intense. Within weeks, he left his previous marriage, and by early 2009, he and Dalia were married. The relationship moved quickly, but so did the problems. Michael had no idea that the woman he had fallen for was plotting against him behind closed doors. Dalia, despite her soft-spoken demeanor and polished appearance, was hiding motives that would later shock even seasoned investigators. From the outside, their home in Boynton Beach looked like any other peaceful residence. Inside, however, suspicion and deception were beginning to grow. Dalia wasn't satisfied with simply being married. According to investigators, she wanted more freedom, more control, and most of all, more money. Michael had assets. He had a house, vehicles, and financial security that Dalia wanted for herself. But divorce wasn't her plan. Dalia decided to eliminate Michael entirely. In her search for someone to help her carry out the murder, Dalia approached a man she had known casually, Mohammed Shahada. He was in his late 20s, a local man who had crossed paths with her before. To him, Dalia's request was surreal. She asked him if he knew someone who could kill her husband. At first, Mohammed wasn't sure if she was serious. But the more they talked, the more disturbed he became. She wasn't joking. Dalia wanted her husband dead, and she wanted it done soon. Rather than cooperate, Mohammed went straight to the Boynton Beach Police Department. What he told them was chilling. A young wife was actively trying to hire a hitman to kill her husband. The police took the information seriously. They knew they had one chance to get it right. If they moved too quickly, Dalia could walk away. If they waited too long, Michael might actually end up dead. The department quickly set up a sting operation. With Mohammed's help, they arranged for Dalia to meet a man she believed was a professional killer. In reality, he was an undercover police officer, Detective Whitey Jean. He posed as the hitman and agreed to meet with Dalia in a parked car in a secluded parking lot. To capture every word, officers placed hidden cameras and audio recording devices in the vehicle. When Dalia met with the undercover detective, she didn't hesitate. She didn't stutter. She was calm, composed, and completely serious. She told him she wanted her husband killed. She asked him if he could carry it out within days. She agreed to pay $7,000 and made it clear that she was, in her words, 5,000% sure about going through with it. At no point during the conversation did she express doubt or fear. Instead, she discussed details, where Michael would be, what time of day would work best, and how she wanted it to look like a robbery gone wrong. The meeting was crucial. It gave the police everything they needed to move forward. They now had Dalia's voice, her face, her words, all captured on camera. But they weren't done yet. To secure an airtight case, they needed one more step. They had to show how Dalia would react when she thought her plan had succeeded. So, on the morning of August 5, 2009, the police staged an elaborate scene. Michael was asked to leave the house early under a pretense. While he was gone, officers taped off the area around their home with yellow crime scene tape. They placed patrol cars nearby, set up a perimeter, and waited. When Dalia returned home, Officers approached her and told her there had been a tragedy. Her husband had been killed in a supposed home invasion. Cameras were rolling the entire time. What followed was a dramatic display. Dahlia collapsed in tears, appearing to be overwhelmed by the news. She sobbed, asked questions, and held her head in her hands. To an untrained eye, it looked like a young wife in distress. But to the officers watching behind the scenes, it was just another performance, one they had anticipated. After allowing the scene to unfold, police brought Dahlia down to the station. There, they confronted her with the truth. In the interview room, the undercover detective who posed as the hitman entered. The look on Dahlia's face changed instantly. She realized she had been caught. What came next would shock even those who had been involved from the start. Despite the evidence, the recordings, the video footage, the eyewitnesses, Dahlia denied everything. She claimed she had no idea what was going on. She said it was all a misunderstanding. But the officers weren't buying it, and they had no reason to. With all the pieces in place, the police made their move. Dahlia Dippolito was officially arrested and charged with solicitation to commit first-degree murder. The woman who had claimed to be a loving wife was now the primary suspect in a plot to end her husband's life for money. The case was far from over, but the foundation had been laid. A young woman with no criminal history had stepped into the role of would-be killer, not by mistake, but by choice. Cameras had caught every step of the journey, from the plan to the payment to the fake crime scene. As Dahlia sat in a holding cell, the story began to spread. News outlets picked up the footage. Reporters swarmed the Boynton Beach Police Department, and the public began to ask, who was Dahlia Dippolito, and why did she want her husband dead? The answers would come, but not right away. What followed was a courtroom battle, a media frenzy, and years of legal drama. The final chapter of the case had not yet been written, but the stage was set. The story of betrayal, greed, and deception was now fully in motion, and it was all captured on tape. As the footage of Dahlia Dippolito's dramatic fake reaction at the staged crime scene made its way onto television screens across the country, the case exploded into the public spotlight. The Boynton Beach Police Department had orchestrated one of the most well-documented sting operations in recent memory, and now the footage was everywhere, on news broadcasts, in headlines, and on social media. People were captivated. How could someone so composed, so young, and so seemingly ordinary try to plan a cold-blooded murder with such calm precision? The video evidence was undeniable. Dahlia had sat in a car with a man she believed to be a hitman. She laid out the plan in clear language. She discussed payment. She answered every question with steady, unemotional resolve. At one point, when the undercover officer warned her again that this couldn't be undone once it started, she replied without hesitation. She knew exactly what she was asking for. But even with the evidence, the story was far from over. Once Dahlia was arrested and formally charged with solicitation to commit first-degree murder, the legal process began, and with it came twists no one quite expected. Her defense team was quick to argue that Dahlia had been manipulated, that she never truly intended to go through with the murder. They painted her as a victim of a publicity-hungry police department, claiming that the entire sting had been sensationalized to attract attention, especially because the footage was aired on the reality show Cops. The defense suggested that Dahlia had been acting, even joking, and that the recordings were taken out of context. But to prosecutors and investigators, there was no mistaking her intent. They believed she was serious and had taken steps toward executing a murder-for-hire plot. They weren't interested in character performances or publicity debates. They were focused on facts. At the center of this case stood Michael Dippolito. In the days following his wife's arrest, he had to come to terms with the fact that someone he trusted with his life had tried to end it. His world had been turned upside down. Though he had a checkered past of his own, he had put much of that behind him and never imagined that his biggest danger would come from inside his own home. Michael, shaken but alive thanks to the police intervention, now found himself the key witness in a criminal case he never saw coming. As investigators continued piecing together the case, more details emerged. They discovered that this wasn't Dahlia's first effort to remove Michael from her life. Months before the sting, there were suspicious incidents. Michael recalled being pulled over by police, who informed him they'd received a tip that he was hiding drugs in his car. The search came up empty, but the incident stood out as strange. Later, investigators would uncover that Dahlia had made anonymous calls to police in an effort to frame Michael and send him back to jail. She had even gone so far as to plant drugs in his vehicle. She wanted him out of the way, either by legal trouble or by death. With that context, her meeting with the undercover officer took on even greater weight. This wasn't an impulsive decision. It was a pattern of behavior. Dahlia's bail hearing made headlines as well. Despite the strong evidence against her, she was granted house arrest while awaiting trial. She returned to live with her mother and was ordered not to have contact with Michael. Meanwhile, the media coverage intensified. The case had all the elements of a gripping drama: betrayal, a hidden camera sting, a fake crime scene, and a beautiful woman at the center of it all. The public reaction was divided. Some viewed Dahlia as a cold and calculating individual who would stop at nothing to get what she wanted. Others were convinced there had to be more to the story, that no one could be that composed while plotting a murder unless something else was going on behind the scenes. As the case moved toward trial, both the prosecution and defense prepared for a legal battle that would be fought not just in court, but in the public eye. Prosecutors had a simple strategy: show the jury the footage and let Dahlia's own words speak for themselves. Her demeanor, her certainty, her planning, it was all on tape. She had agreed to the killing. She had arranged the time. She had confirmed the payment. The footage didn't require interpretation. The defense, on the other hand, had to work much harder. Their claim was that the entire operation was manufactured, exaggerated for entertainment purposes. They argued that Dahlia had been encouraged to say things she didn't mean, or that she was playing along to appease someone she thought was dangerous. They tried to reframe the narrative, portraying her not as a criminal mastermind, but as someone caught up in a bad situation, pressured by others, and now facing the consequences of poor judgment. The first trial began in 2011. Inside the courtroom, the tension was heavy. Michael DiPolito took the stand and described how he felt after learning his wife had tried to have him killed. He detailed the bizarre incidents that preceded the sting operation, including the planted drugs and strange police stops. His voice was calm, but his words carried weight. The jury listened closely. Then came the video. The footage of Dahlia's meeting with the undercover officer was shown in court, followed by her dramatic reaction at the fake crime scene. Jurors watched as she sobbed uncontrollably, then compared it with her matter-of-fact planning of the murder just days earlier. The contrast was striking. Despite the strength of the evidence, the first trial ended in a mistrial. The jury was deadlocked, unable to reach a unanimous verdict. Legal errors and concerns about media influence had disrupted the process. It was a frustrating outcome for the prosecution, but they remained determined to pursue justice. Another trial was scheduled, and then another. Over the next few years, the case dragged on through the legal system. Dahlia's defense team continued to appeal, argue, and shift strategies. At one point, they claimed that she and Michael had staged the entire hitman plot as a publicity stunt to help launch a reality TV career. That theory was met with skepticism, especially for Michael himself, who vehemently denied it. For him, this wasn't a game. It was a real plan with real consequences that nearly cost him his life. By this point, the case had become one of the most talked about criminal trials in recent Florida history. Dahlia DiPolito had gone from a private citizen to a national figure, her name forever tied to one of the most bizarre murder plots ever caught on camera. Yet through it all, the final chapter remained unwritten. Dahlia had not confessed. She had not been convicted. She had not been sentenced. That moment, the conclusion everyone had been waiting for, was still to come. What began as a quiet marriage in a sunny South Florida neighborhood had turned into a legal storm that showed no signs of settling. And while the world continued to watch, one question remained at the center of it all. Would justice finally be served? By the time Dahlia Dippolito returned to court for her final trial in 2017, nearly 8 years had passed since she sat in a car with an undercover cop and calmly ordered the murder of her husband. The case, once a shocking local scandal, had grown into a national obsession. The media had followed every development, every courtroom argument, every appeal. But now, the delays were over. This trial would decide her fate. The courtroom was packed. Reporters, legal analysts, and curious onlookers filled the seats. Prosecutors came prepared with the same key evidence that had defined the case from the beginning: the video. Dahlia's own words, her clear intent, and her unwavering certainty were all caught on hidden camera. There was no ambiguity in her tone when she told the undercover officer she was 5,000% sure about going through with the plan. The footage showed more than intent. It revealed character, confidence, and cold resolve. Michael Dippolito, now in his mid-40s, sat quietly in the courtroom. He had moved on from the emotional wreckage left behind by the attempted murder, but the memories were still raw. He hadn't asked for attention. He hadn't wanted fame. All he ever wanted was to build a peaceful life, and instead he had been cast as the intended victim in a plot that nearly ended in tragedy. His testimony remained consistent. He didn't believe Dahlia had been coerced, manipulated, or misunderstood. He believed she meant to kill him and take everything he had. The prosecution's case was tight and focused. They revisited Dahlia's earlier attempts to frame Michael, planting drugs in his car, making anonymous calls to police in hopes of getting him arrested and sent back to prison. They showed how those earlier efforts had failed, and how the murder-for-hire plot was her next step. Prosecutors explained that Dahlia didn't want a divorce because she couldn't get what she wanted that way. She wanted Michael gone permanently, so she could take over his assets without legal hassle. The defense tried to push back with their long-standing argument that Dahlia never intended to go through with the crime, and that the entire sting operation was exaggerated for television. They again floated the idea that the plan had been staged as a publicity stunt between her and Michael, although that theory had long since crumbled under cross-examination and denial. They leaned into emotional appeals, painting Dahlia as a young woman overwhelmed by pressure and confused by her own choices. But by now, those arguments were tired. The jury had heard them all before. Dahlia herself didn't testify at the final trial. She sat quietly, often glancing down, avoiding the cameras that had once captured every expression she tried to fake. Her demeanor was far removed from the confident woman seen in the recordings from 2009. Gone was the smile, the flirtation, the poise. In its place was silence. When the jury returned with a verdict, the room was still. It had taken them less than a day to deliberate. They found Dahlia Dippolito guilty of solicitation to commit first-degree murder. After years of courtroom delays, mistrials, and media spin, justice had finally been delivered. During the sentencing phase, the judge reviewed not only the severity of the crime, but also the impact it had on the victim. Michael had survived, but not without damage. He lived with the trauma of knowing that the person he once trusted most had tried to end his life without hesitation. The betrayal had left emotional scars that couldn't be erased by time. In the end, Dahlia Dippolito was sentenced to 16 years in prison. There were no outbursts, no dramatic courtroom scenes, just quiet resolution. The woman who once wept on camera as police pretended her husband had been killed was now led away in handcuffs, for real. For law enforcement, the case was a clear example of the power of proactive policing and well-executed undercover operations. The Boynton Beach Police Department had stopped a murder before it happened. They had used surveillance, strategy, and patience to catch a killer before she could strike. And though the case had taken years to reach its conclusion, the outcome proved their work had not been in vain. The Dahlia Dippolito case is often remembered for its sensational footage and dramatic plot, but at its core, it's a story about something darker: the ease with which greed and deception can take root, even in the most personal of relationships. It's about how charm can mask cruelty, and how trust, once broken, can never be fully repaired. In the years since the final verdict, Michael Dippolito has kept a relatively low profile. He has declined to make a career out of the story, despite the public fascination with what happened to him. For him, the most important chapter was the one that didn't happen, the one where the plan succeeded. Dahlia Dippolito remains incarcerated in the Florida prison system. Her appeals have been denied, and her case continues to be studied by legal experts, true crime enthusiasts, and law enforcement professionals as a striking example of premeditated domestic crime caught in real time. A wife, a husband, a hidden camera, a fake murder scene, and a real crime that, thankfully, never reached its deadly conclusion. In the end, the justice system did what it was designed to do. It stopped a tragedy, exposed the truth, and held the guilty accountable. And that, in a story filled with deception, was the one thing that couldn't be faked. A glamorous ex-showgirl, a wealthy husband, and a shocking disappearance. What began as a missing person case quickly turned into one of Arizona's most gruesome murders. Behind closed doors, a dark secret unraveled. This is the chilling true story of betrayal, greed, and a murder meticulously planned. In the early 2000s, Phoenix, Arizona, was home to Jay and Marjorie Orban, a couple who, to those looking in from the outside, seemed like a picture of success. Jay Orban was 45, a seasoned and respected jewelry dealer who often traveled across the country to buy and sell high-end pieces. His work had built a comfortable life for the family, a life that included a spacious home, luxury cars, and financial freedom. Marjorie, 43, had once been a Las Vegas showgirl. She had transitioned into a quieter lifestyle, working occasionally in the jewelry business alongside her husband and caring for their young son. Their lives seemed stable, perhaps even enviable. But underneath that surface was a far more complicated and dangerous reality, one that would end in betrayal, brutality, and murder. September 8, 2004, marked Jay Orban's 45th birthday. That day, he returned home from a business trip to Florida and New Mexico, where he'd been finalizing a jewelry deal. Jay was supposed to be gone for only a few days, and by all accounts, he was looking forward to being home to celebrate with his family. But something went wrong shortly after he arrived. He was never seen alive again. Initially, Jay's disappearance didn't trigger immediate alarm. A few days passed with no word from him, but because he often traveled and sometimes extended his trips, friends and even family didn't panic. Still, as the days turned into weeks, concern grew. Jay was a reliable communicator. He always kept touch, especially with business associates and his loved ones. His sudden silence was unusual and out of character. As worry spread, Marjorie Orban's behavior began to raise questions. She offered vague explanations about Jay's whereabouts. To some, she said he'd left town again on another trip. To others, she claimed he was handling a deal that required secrecy. Her stories didn't line up. Meanwhile, those closest to Jay began pressing for answers. Eventually, his mother reported him missing to the Phoenix police. When investigators began looking into Jay's disappearance, they immediately noticed the gaps in Marjorie's story. There were no travel records, no calls from Jay, no bank activity. Nothing to suggest he had left town as she claimed. As the days passed, suspicion grew. Then came a discovery that changed everything. On October 23, 2004, just over 6 weeks after Jay was last seen, police found a large plastic storage container abandoned in the desert on the outskirts of Phoenix. Inside was a male torso. The body had been carefully dismembered. There was no head, no arms, no legs, just the torso. It was later identified as belonging to Jay Orban. The discovery of the torso marked a gruesome turning point in the investigation. It wasn't just a missing person case anymore. It was a homicide. And the brutality of the act, dismemberment, disposal, suggested a highly personal and carefully planned crime. Investigators turned their full attention to Marjorie Orban. What they uncovered would reveal a chilling double life. While Jay had been on the road working, Marjorie had been involved with multiple men. She had rekindled past relationships and formed new ones, often while her husband was away. She was living a secret life filled with lies, infidelity, and manipulation. Detectives found that she had spent time researching how to dispose of a body. Internet searches showed chilling patterns, and her computer contained pages on decomposition, murder cases, and cutting tools. Further investigation revealed that she had purchased jigsaw blades shortly before Jay disappeared. Police believed she had used those blades to dismember her husband after killing him. The timeline began to fit together. Jay had returned home on the evening of September 8th. By the next morning, he was gone and never heard from again. Authorities believed that Marjorie shot him, likely while he was still inside their home. Then, sometime in the following hours or days, she dismembered his body and began to dispose of the parts in different desert locations around Phoenix. Her motive, detectives concluded, was a mix of greed and desire for independence. Marjorie wanted to continue her lifestyle, money, freedom, affairs, without Jay. But she also didn't want a divorce, which might limit her access to their wealth. By killing him, she stood to gain full financial control, including life insurance benefits, property, and business assets. Marjorie's life quickly became the center of intense scrutiny. The media caught wind of the case and latched onto the narrative. A glamorous ex-showgirl with a hidden life and a cold heart. Reporters dug into her past and her present, revealing a web of lovers, lies, and secrets. Photos of her in court, alongside dramatic headlines, spread across newspapers and television screens nationwide. As evidence mounted, detectives gathered enough to charge her with murder. But there was still much work to be done. The physical evidence, though disturbing, was limited. Only Jay's torso had been recovered. Much of the case would rely on circumstantial proof, digital forensics, and witness testimony about Marjorie's behavior before and after the crime. By the time the trial date was set, the public had already formed strong opinions. But the case was far from simple. Prosecutors needed to build a narrative that showed not only that Jay had been murdered, but that Marjorie had planned it. They needed to prove beyond reasonable doubt that this wasn't an act of passion. It was premeditated. As the case prepared to go to trial, the focus shifted from discovery to justice. And while the full truth of what happened inside the Orban home on that September night would never be known in exact detail, the pieces were starting to come together. Jay Orban's life had ended in violence, but the full story of betrayal, manipulation, and calculated cruelty was only beginning to unfold. By late 2004, the murder of Jay Orban had become more than a local crime story. It was now a chilling case drawing national attention. The brutal dismemberment, the calculated nature of the crime, and the involvement of a former Las Vegas showgirl turned suburban housewife made for a sensational narrative. As investigators continued to build their case, Marjorie Orban remained at the center of it all. Calm in public, but under increasing pressure behind closed doors, her carefully controlled world was beginning to unravel. Detectives knew early on that they had no eyewitnesses, no confession, and no complete body. But what they did have was motive, circumstantial evidence, and inconsistencies in Marjorie's own words. Her behavior after Jay's disappearance was puzzling, cold, unemotional, and evasive. She didn't seem distressed about her missing husband. Instead, she continued her usual routines and appeared more concerned with protecting her image and maintaining her secret relationships than with helping the investigation. Investigators began pulling records, phone logs, computer data, credit card transactions, and the digital trail told its own story. Around the time Jay was believed to have been killed, Marjorie's phone activity showed frequent contact with multiple men. Some of these men were more than casual acquaintances. They were romantic partners she had been seeing behind Jay's back. She had presented herself differently to each one, telling stories that shifted based on what she needed from them: emotional support, companionship, or attention. The timing of her purchases also raised red flags. She had bought power tools, including jigsaw blades, shortly before Jay's disappearance. These weren't the kind of tools she'd used before, nor were they associated with any known home projects. More troubling was the fact that traces of blood, later confirmed as Jay's, were found in several places around the Orban home, including the garage. Investigators believed this was likely where the dismemberment took place. As the forensic evidence slowly came together, the picture became clearer. Jay had likely been killed shortly after returning home. There were signs he hadn't unpacked. His car was still parked outside. Nothing indicated he had left on his own. Police believed Marjorie lured him home, waited for the right moment, and killed him, most likely with a gun, though no murder weapon was ever found. After the killing, they theorized, she kept Jay's body hidden for several days. During that time, she continued to go about her daily life, caring for their child, speaking with friends, and even interacting with people who were looking for Jay. All the while, she was planning the next phase of the crime, disposing of the body. Using the jigsaw blades, she dismembered him piece by piece, carefully packing his torso into a plastic storage container. The rest of his remains were never found, likely scattered or buried in remote desert areas. As word of Jay's murder spread, attention turned not just to Marjorie's involvement, but to the double life she had been leading. People who had once admired her beauty and charm now saw a different side. She was intelligent, but manipulative, attractive but cold. Under the surface of a smiling wife and mother was a woman who had deceived almost everyone around her. Prosecutors began preparing for trial with that very image in mind, presenting Marjorie not just as a murderer, but as someone who had carefully constructed a false life to get what she wanted. Part of what made the case so compelling was the psychology behind it. Marjorie wasn't driven by rage or jealousy alone. She was driven by control. She didn't want to lose the lifestyle Jay provided, but she also didn't want to be tied down by him. She wanted access to the money, the house, the freedom, and the ability to live on her own terms. Murder, in her mind, may have seemed like the most efficient solution. As detectives continued to gather testimony, they interviewed several of Marjorie's lovers. Some admitted they had no idea she was married. Others had their suspicions, but were caught up in the excitement of her attention. Many of them described her as seductive, secretive, and emotionally detached. One man even said she talked about starting over and getting rid of the past, words that would later seem loaded with meaning. The relationships weren't simply romantic, they were strategic. Marjorie used charm as a weapon. The case began to solidify around a timeline, strengthened by physical evidence, digital footprints, and Marjorie's own conflicting statements. Still, a major challenge remained. Without a full body and without a confession, the prosecution had to rely heavily on circumstantial evidence. They needed a strong, cohesive story that the jury could believe beyond reasonable doubt. It had to explain the motive, the means, the timeline, and the actions Marjorie took before and after the murder. Meanwhile, Marjorie continued to maintain her innocence. Publicly, she kept a composed face. In court appearances, she was polite, even graceful. But behind closed doors, those who observed her noted a striking absence of emotion. She didn't speak of Jay with love, regret, or even anger, just attachment. Some of the most powerful images from the courtroom during pretrial hearings were of Marjorie sitting stone-faced, while details of her husband's murder were described aloud. Outside the courtroom, the media painted her as a Black Widow figure. Headlines highlighted her beauty and her past as a Las Vegas showgirl. Television specials ran profiles that detailed her affair-filled life, her ambitions, and her obsession with control. The public fascination with the case grew, not just because of the murder itself, but because of what Marjorie seemed to represent, a woman who had everything and still wanted more, so much more that she was willing to kill. As the trial date approached, the prosecution focused on tightening their case. They gathered expert witnesses in forensics, digital analysis, and psychology. They studied Marjorie's behavior in the weeks after Jay's disappearance. They prepared to show that she had both the motive and the ability to carry out the crime, and that her lies, movements, and actions were not those of a grieving wife, but of a cold and calculating killer. By the end of 2008, nearly 4 years after Jay's murder, the trial was ready to begin. It would be long, emotionally draining, and filled with difficult testimony. But for Jay's family and friends, it was a necessary step toward justice. They had waited years to learn what really happened, and why. And soon, a jury would hear the story in full. The truth, hidden behind a beautiful smile and a carefully constructed life, was about to be exposed. In 2008, nearly 4 years after Jay Orban's brutal death, the case of Marjorie and Orban finally went to trial. It would be one of the most highly anticipated and closely followed courtroom dramas in Arizona's recent history. With no direct witnesses, no full body, and no confession, the trial was built piece by piece, just like the murder itself. Prosecutors knew they had to rely on the strength of their narrative, forensic evidence, digital trails, and most powerfully, Marjorie's own words and actions. The courtroom was packed as opening statements began. Prosecutors painted a chilling picture of a woman who had grown tired of her marriage and viewed her husband not as a partner, but as an obstacle. They told the jury how Marjorie, a former showgirl, was living a secret life filled with multiple affairs, calculated manipulation, and an overwhelming desire for independence, both emotional and financial. They explained that Jay Orban, a devoted husband and successful jewelry dealer, had returned home on his 45th birthday, only to be murdered shortly after entering the house. The prosecution's theory was that Marjorie had planned Jay's murder in advance. She had bought jigsaw blades prior to his return and researched body disposal and decomposition methods on her computer. After killing him, likely with a gun, she dismembered his body in the garage using the tools she had prepared. She then stored his torso in a plastic storage bin, which she left in the desert. The remaining body parts, investigators believed, were scattered or buried elsewhere and were never found. Much of the state's case relied on circumstantial, but highly persuasive evidence. Forensic specialists testified about blood traces found in the Orban garage and bathroom. Analysts presented Marjorie's internet history, which included searches for cleaning products, dismemberment techniques, and murder cases with similar patterns. Her cell phone records showed she had contacted several of her lovers in the days immediately following Jay's disappearance, but made no real attempt to contact her husband. Witnesses, former friends, neighbors, and past lovers, described Marjorie's behavior as cold, controlled, and deceitful. The prosecution argued that this wasn't a crime of passion. It was a methodical, calculated act. Marjorie had waited for Jay to come home. She had all the tools ready. She knew how to clean up. She knew how to hide what she had done. And she knew that if she succeeded, she would inherit Jay's estate, run his business, and walk away free to live her life without him. The defense team, for their part, tried to cast doubt on the evidence. They argued that the case was built on speculation, not facts. There were no eyewitnesses. The murder weapon was never found. They questioned the reliability of the digital data and suggested that other explanations could exist for Marjorie's behavior and internet searches. The defense hinted that someone else might have been involved, even suggesting that Marjorie had been framed or manipulated. But they offered no credible alternative theory, and the prosecution's case remained consistent and supported by an extensive trail of evidence. The trial lasted 8 months. Day after day, the jury listened to testimony from investigators, forensic scientists, computer experts, and acquaintances of both Jay and Marjorie. The courtroom saw crime scene photographs, diagrams of the Orban home, and digital logs outlining every move Marjorie had made during the critical days after Jay's disappearance. One of the most emotional moments came when Jay's family members took the stand. His mother and sister described him as a generous, kind, and dependable man. They spoke of the anguish they endured not knowing where he was, and then the horror of learning what had happened. Their grief underscored the real human loss at the center of the trial, a man loved by many, murdered in the most brutal way by someone he trusted the most. Marjorie did not testify. Throughout the trial, she maintained her composure, often emotionless, sometimes even smiling slightly when cameras turned her way. Her lack of reaction during graphic testimony was noted by many observers and only deepened public perception of her as detached and remorseless. Finally, in May 2009, after months of proceedings, the jury reached its verdict. Marjorie and Orban was found guilty of first-degree murder. She showed little emotion as the verdict was read. For the Orban family, it was a moment of justice. For the prosecution, it was the end of a long and difficult case. And for the public, it marked the conclusion of one of the most haunting true crime stories in Arizona's history. The judge sentenced Marjorie to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She would never again walk free, never again manipulate her way through life. She would spend the rest of her days behind bars, in sharp contrast to the glamorous and self-indulgent life she had once pursued. No deals, no appeals for sympathy, just life, constrained, permanent, and deserved. In the years following her conviction, the case of Marjorie Orban continued to appear in books, documentaries, and television specials. It wasn't just the horror of the crime that captured people's attention, but the layers behind it. A beautiful woman with a dark secret, a successful businessman who never saw the betrayal coming, and a marriage that hid a chilling reality. The case remains a grim reminder of how appearances can be deceiving. To the world, Marjorie was a devoted wife, a mother, a woman who had left her showgirl past behind to build a family. But in truth, she was calculating and ruthless, willing to destroy the man who gave her everything, simply because she wanted more. Jay Orban never got to see his son grow up. He never got the chance to enjoy the success he had worked so hard to build. His life was taken by someone who had once promised to love and protect him. And though justice was eventually served, the loss to his family can never be undone. The story of Marjorie and Jay Orban isn't just about murder. It's about betrayal at its deepest level. It's about the lengths to which someone will go when they believe they deserve more, and no one, not even their closest partner, stands in the way. A dying husband, a devoted wife, or so it seemed. Behind closed doors, a twisted plan was taking shape. Poison, lies, and brutal violence turned a tragic illness into a calculated murder. This is the chilling true story of Wendy Andriano, one of Arizona's most shocking cases of betrayal and cold-blooded greed. In the quiet suburbs of Phoenix, Arizona, the Andriano family lived what appeared to be an ordinary life. Wendy Andriano, 30 years old, was a stay-at-home mother raising 2 young children. Her husband, Joe Andriano, 33, had once worked as a telephone sales representative. He was quiet, devoted to his family, and known for his polite, gentle demeanor. But behind the closed doors of their modest apartment, life had taken a grim turn. Joe was dying of a rare, incurable cancer, adenoid cystic carcinoma, a disease that was slowly paralyzing him, leaving him increasingly frail and dependent. As Joe's condition worsened, he became confined to their home. Unable to work and in constant pain, he required round-the-clock care. Wendy stepped into that role. From the outside, she seemed like a devoted wife and mother. Neighbors occasionally saw her pushing a stroller or bringing groceries inside, maintaining a calm presence while balancing a tragic reality. But beneath the surface, something much darker was unfolding, something even those closest to the family didn't see coming. Joe's illness changed everything in their lives. Their once active social life slowed to a stop. Medical bills stacked up. Joe's physical presence faded with each passing week. He could barely move on his own, and his speech became slurred. The man Wendy had married was disappearing right in front of her. While Joe was fading, Wendy was changing, but not in a way anyone expected. Instead of growing more committed during her husband's decline, Wendy began to detach. Friends and witnesses would later say she was growing frustrated and resentful. The isolation of being a full-time caregiver wore on her. But rather than seeking help, Wendy sought escape. She started going out at night, telling people she needed a break. She drank more, partied more, and soon she began having affairs. One man she met at a bar later testified in court that Wendy never told him about Joe's illness. She said she was getting divorced. Wendy had created 2 lives, one at home, caring for her dying husband and children, and another outside, where she presented herself as a free woman looking for fun. She played both parts skillfully, but the cracks were forming. What Wendy didn't know, or didn't care to acknowledge, was that those cracks were about to be exposed. As Joe's illness progressed, Wendy began making calls that would later become crucial in the investigation. She contacted a hospice care provider the day before the murder, asking detailed questions about the effects of specific drugs on terminal patients. She also attempted to secure a life insurance policy for Joe without his knowledge. When the insurance agent insisted that Joe would need to sign off, Wendy dropped it. But the message was clear. She was planning something, and she didn't want Joe to know. On the surface, Joe remained trusting. He had no reason to believe the woman he had married would ever harm him. Despite his condition, he still tried to make decisions for their family. He still believed Wendy had his best interests at heart. That blind trust would cost him his life. The night of October 8, 2000, began like many others. Wendy told a neighbor she was feeling overwhelmed. Around midnight, she made a 911 call. Her voice was frantic. She claimed her husband was dying and that he had attacked her. She begged for help. When officers arrived at the scene, they found a nightmare. Joe Andriano was dead. His body showed signs of an intense, prolonged attack. Blood was splattered across the room. He had been beaten with a bar stool and stabbed multiple times. It was clear this wasn't a peaceful death, nor a sudden medical collapse. Something violent had happened here. Wendy met the police at the door. She had minor injuries, which she claimed were from trying to protect herself. She told officers that Joe had become aggressive and violent, and that she had no choice but to defend herself. But nothing in the scene matched her story. Joe had been severely poisoned with sodium azide, a highly toxic chemical used in labs and automotive airbags. It wasn't something commonly found in households. Investigators were immediately suspicious. How did she obtain it? Why was it in his system? And more importantly, how could a man so weak, so close to death, have launched a physical attack strong enough to provoke such a brutal counterattack? Detectives began piecing the case together quickly. First, Joe's physical condition was examined. Medical experts confirmed what they already suspected. Joe was almost entirely immobile. He could barely walk. His muscles had weakened to the point where lifting himself was a struggle. The idea that he could have violently attacked Wendy, as she claimed, didn't hold up. Second, the nature of the attack contradicted the claim of self-defense. Joe had been poisoned first, likely incapacitated, before being beaten and stabbed. This wasn't a spontaneous act. It was methodical. He didn't die quickly. The evidence suggested suffering. Overkill. The most chilling detail came from the autopsy. The amount of poison in Joe's system was enough to knock out or kill a person. Yet Wendy had continued to beat and stab him afterward. The brutality pointed to rage, but also, perhaps, to someone trying to make sure the job was finished. In the days that followed, detectives began examining Wendy's life more closely. They found records of her attempts to secure life insurance. They interviewed friends and neighbors, who revealed that Wendy had grown distant and secretive. She had talked about wanting a different life. Some had even heard her say she felt trapped. Then came the testimony from one of her lovers, a man who said Wendy never told him her husband was terminally ill. She had introduced herself as single and eager to start fresh. He was shocked to learn, only later, that her husband had been dying at home the entire time. Piece by piece, the facade of a loving, overwhelmed wife fell apart. Wendy's behavior didn't match the image she tried to portray. She hadn't been pushed to the edge by a violent outburst. She had planned this. As the investigation deepened, detectives and prosecutors turned their full attention to Wendy Andriano's movements, statements, and behavior leading up to the night of October 8, 2000. What they uncovered was a disturbing portrait of a woman leading a double life, one marked not by desperation or fear, but by calculation, deceit, and cold ambition. The forensic evidence had already poked holes in her story. Joe's body had tested positive for sodium azide, a deadly substance rarely found in households. It's not easily available to the general public and is typically used in labs or industrial settings. Investigators suspected Wendy obtained it deliberately, with a purpose in mind. It wasn't a substance you'd accidentally introduce into your home. She had likely planned its use far in advance. In addition to the poisoning, Joe had been subjected to an extraordinarily violent beating. The weapon used, a bar stool, was found at the scene, covered in blood. He had also been stabbed in the neck. Medical experts said the force used in the attack indicated rage and intent, not fear or self-defense. And crucially, Joe had been so physically weak by then that it was nearly impossible for him to have posed any serious threat. What followed was a thorough examination of Wendy's digital and personal footprint. Investigators searched phone records, emails, and financial statements. It became clear that she had tried to take out a life insurance policy on Joe, something he never signed or agreed to. The motive wasn't just about ending suffering, it was about financial gain. With Joe dead, Wendy would have full control over the couple's assets and their 2 children, as well as the opportunity to collect a payout, had her plan succeeded. Detectives also uncovered that just the day before the murder, Wendy had called hospice care, inquiring about the effects of various medications on terminally ill patients. She specifically asked what would happen if a patient missed doses or was given a combination of drugs. That call, recorded and documented, showed an unusual level of planning. She wasn't just overwhelmed or exhausted. She was preparing. As the case began to build, Wendy's behavior became another focal point. In the days after Joe's death, she appeared composed. Her injuries were minor. She didn't seem shaken or traumatized. She continued to tell the same story. Joe had become violent and irrational, and she had no choice but to fight back. But the evidence told another story, one that didn't align with fear or instinctual survival. When police spoke to neighbors, a common theme emerged. Wendy had been socializing more often in the months leading up to the murder. Some recalled seeing her dressed up and heading out late at night, often without any mention of where she was going. One neighbor recalled seeing men visit the apartment when Joe was home, too ill to get out of bed. Wendy's extramarital affairs were no longer rumors. They were fact. One of her lovers, Michael Carrion, became a key witness in the case. He testified that Wendy had never told him she was married to a terminally ill man. She claimed she was in the middle of a divorce and that her husband had already moved out. He was stunned when he saw her on the news and learned the truth. The prosecution built a timeline that painted a chilling picture. Wendy was exhausted with her role as caregiver, no longer interested in the man she had once loved. She didn't want to wait for a natural death to free her from responsibility. So she chose a faster route, one that would bring her both independence and financial relief. When the trial began in 2004, the courtroom was filled with tension. Wendy Andriano sat quietly at the defense table, dressed neatly, her demeanor calm and reserved. But the evidence that would unfold over the following weeks revealed a calculated and violent act hidden beneath a soft-spoken surface. Prosecutor Juan Martinez took the lead. Known for his aggressive style, he walked the jury through every piece of evidence. He emphasized that this wasn't an act of mercy. This was premeditated murder. He showed how Wendy had researched toxins, lied about her marriage, and attempted to profit from Joe's death. He introduced photographs of the crime scene, autopsy reports, and testimonies that revealed Wendy's cold and detached attitude in the days following the murder. Martinez also pointed out inconsistencies in Wendy's 911 call and her interview with police. If she truly feared for her life, why had she waited to call 911? Why had she poisoned Joe first, then beaten and stabbed him? Why not leave the home if she feared danger? And how could someone so physically weak manage to launch the kind of attack Wendy described? Her defense attorney, Dan Rainak, tried to paint a different picture. He claimed Wendy was under unbearable pressure, that she was exhausted, mentally and emotionally drained, and that Joe had become verbally abusive as his illness progressed. He argued that Joe's death was not planned, but the result of a confrontation gone horribly wrong. He brought up Wendy's role as a mother and caregiver and pleaded for understanding. But the jury wasn't convinced. The evidence was overwhelming. Toxicology reports, life insurance inquiries, testimonies from her lovers, forensic photos that showed deliberate, extensive violence. Wendy's story simply didn't align with the facts. As part of trial, a timeline was presented that showed how the attack unfolded over time. Experts testified that Joe would have suffered immensely before he died. The poisoning didn't kill him instantly. He would have been aware, though barely able to move. Then came the beating, blunt force trauma that crushed parts of his skull. Then finally, the stabbing, the final blow. The jury sat in silence during this portion of the trial. Some looked away during the medical testimony. But all understood one thing clearly. This wasn't the act of a woman trying to escape abuse. This was premeditated, violent murder carried out over a period of time with chilling determination. The most striking aspect of the trial wasn't the crime itself. It was Wendy's demeanor. Calm, composed, and often emotionless. She listened to the evidence without visible reaction. Witnesses remarked that it was hard to reconcile the brutal nature of the crime with the woman sitting quietly in the courtroom. But to the prosecution, that contrast was exactly the point. Wendy had worn a mask for months, perhaps years. One of concern and compassion, of loyalty and dedication. But underneath, prosecutors said, was a woman who saw her husband not as a dying man who needed care, but as a problem that needed to be eliminated. By the time the trial neared its conclusion, the picture was complete. Wendy Andriano, once a mother and wife living in the shadows of her husband's illness, had become the focus of one of Arizona's most disturbing and methodically investigated homicide cases. The evidence against her was not only strong, it was overwhelming. Still, the final moments in court would determine whether the jury saw her as a desperate woman pushed to the edge or a cold, calculated killer driven by greed. The prosecution's case had walked jurors through every step of Wendy's descent, from caretaker to murderer. Prosecutor Juan Martinez, known for his sharp and relentless courtroom presence, had drawn clear lines between motive, means, and opportunity. He reminded the jury that Wendy had made detailed calls to hospice and insurance agencies, lied to multiple people about her marriage, and maintained a secret life that included romantic relationships with other men. But perhaps most damaging was the medical testimony. Experts explained that Joe Andriano had been poisoned before being beaten and stabbed. He had not died quickly. He had likely suffered, partially aware and unable to fight back, as his wife attacked him repeatedly. The use of sodium azide made it impossible to mistake this for a moment of passion or fear. This was not an act of a woman defending herself. It was premeditation, step by step. To the defense, however, this was a tragic situation where emotions, illness, and personal stress collided. Wendy's attorney, Dan Rainak, asked the jury to consider the immense psychological toll of caring for a dying husband and raising 2 children alone. He portrayed Wendy as a woman under immense emotional strain, someone who snapped after months of pain and isolation. He painted Joe not just as a victim, but as a man who had, at times, lashed out at Wendy verbally, perhaps even physically. But those claims were not supported by the evidence or by testimony from family and friends. Rainak also argued that Wendy's behavior following the murder, calm, collected, and emotionally restrained, was a result of shock. But again, this explanation did not sit well with jurors who had listened to hours of detailed testimony about her planning, deception, and deliberate actions leading up to the crime. When Wendy took the stand in her own defense, she spoke calmly, often tearfully, describing a life of hardship, fear, and mental exhaustion. She insisted that she never intended to kill Joe, that she had only tried to help him die peacefully. But under cross-examination, her account faltered. Prosecutor Martinez pressed hard, pointing out her inconsistent statements, her affairs, and her financial motives. He reminded the court that a mercy killing does not involve brutal violence after poisoning. After weeks of testimony, closing arguments, and deliberation, the jury reached a verdict. On November 18, 2004, Wendy Andriano was found guilty of first-degree murder. It was a unanimous decision. The jurors had not believed the story of a grieving wife pushed beyond her limits. They had seen a woman who had carefully planned her husband's death and followed through with brutal efficiency. But the trial wasn't over yet. The next phase was sentencing, where the jury would decide whether Wendy should face life in prison or the death penalty. The prosecution made their stance clear. This was not just a murder. It was a cold, calculated act that warranted the maximum punishment. During the penalty phase, the court heard more about Wendy's life, her family, and her children. Her defense team pleaded for mercy, arguing that her children still needed their mother, even from prison. They pointed to her lack of a prior criminal record and the emotional breakdown she had experienced during Joe's illness. But the jury had not forgotten the violence, the deception, and the motive behind the crime. The brutality of Joe's death, the poisoning, the beating, the stabbing, was not something they could overlook. Nor could they ignore the fact that Wendy had tried to benefit financially from the murder. In December 2004, Wendy Andriano was sentenced to death. She became one of the few women on Arizona's death row. The courtroom was silent as the sentence was read. There was no outburst, no visible reaction from Wendy. She stood still, eyes lowered, her future sealed. Following the verdict, the public and media reacted with shock, sadness, and disbelief. How could a mother and wife carry out such a cold-blooded act? How could someone responsible for caring for a dying man become his killer? For Joe Andriano's family, the verdict brought a measure of justice. They remembered Joe as a kind and gentle man who had done nothing to deserve what happened to him. His illness had already taken so much from him, his mobility, his independence, and eventually his voice. But it was his wife, the person he trusted most, who took the final thing he had left, his life. As for Wendy, she has continued to appeal her sentence over the years, but the original ruling still stands. She remains on death row in Arizona, her case often cited in true crime documentaries and legal discussions about female offenders and the death penalty. The Andriano case is more than just a crime story. It's a haunting example of betrayal at its most intimate level. It's a reminder that murder isn't always committed in alleys or by strangers. Sometimes it happens in the home by someone who smiles to your face while planning your end behind closed doors. Wendy Andriano did not kill in a moment of panic or desperation. She planned it. She prepared for it. And in the end, she executed it. Whether driven by greed, resentment, or a desire for freedom, she made a choice. And that choice ended a man's life and forever shattered a family. The case of Wendy Andriano remains one of Arizona's most chilling examples of a calculated domestic murder, and a stark reminder that appearances can be deceiving.